Yo, check this out. This is Wayne Wonder, representing for Warwick LTV. You see the vision, don't it? See the vision. Warwick LTV. Keep it locked.
I'm gonna tell you. We, as bloggers, these are the issues that we need to address. You understand what I said? Set the bar for the youth. Share, like, and subscribe, and stay tuned to the channel. I don't know all this shit. Yes, I, brothers and sisters, give thanks once again. Greetings in the mighty name of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I, and all things good and wonderful amongst us. Welcome viewers and subscribers. Viewers, if you like the content, subscribe. I'm going to help grow the platform. You see. Yeah. Well, so today we are going to take the time out to pay respect to Leonard Percival Howell. Seeing a lot of them obviously know who that is and things like that. And as the first Rasta. Now, I want to state this clear before. Black people has never detached from them roots, them culture. They've always had this consciousness, regardless of who. You know, many men before Howell, Leonard Howell, always have that agenda, and as a pivotal point of view. Nonetheless, Leonard Howell was the first Rasta man who stepped forward and said Rastafari as a movement and His Majesty as the Godhead, the God for the whole thing, the man. You know, see it, yeah. So, without no further ado, I'll read from it because it's a long read. I'm going to hope the eye them take the time out for you. Listen. I think it's, yeah. See it? So, make we get on with it with all due respect. Enough love and respect to Leonard Percival Howell. The abstract. This article is about Leonard Percival Howell, the man who is widely regarded as the founder of the Rastafari movement, which started in Jamaica in 1932. The article focuses on the attempts to suppress Howell during the fundamental phase of the Rastafari movement from 1932 to 1954. This was the period in which Howell began preaching the divinity of Haile Selassie, who was crowned the Emperor of Ethiopia in 1930. In 1937, Howell established a friendly organization known as the Ethiopian Salvation Society, and in 1940 started the first Rastafari community in the hills of the parish of St. Catherine, Jamaica. These and his other religio-political activities made Howell the target of one of the longest and most aggressive campaigns to suppress an anti-colonial activist during the late colonial period in Jamaica. However, one of the main points of this article is that the attempts to suppress Howell who was seen by the colonial government as seditious, implicated not just the colonial regime, but also a number of other opponents within the society. This article is an attempt to show that Howell's suppression was not exclusively a colonial endeavor, but a society-wide campaign to undermine his leadership in order to disband the Rastafari movement. Howell advocated an anti-colonialism that was seen as too revolutionary by every participant in the campaign to suppress him and his movement. And particularly aggravating was the notion that a black monarch was the fulfillment of a biblical prophecy, and whose ascension signaled the start of a black nationalism as a global liberation movement to end white rule over Africans and people of African descent. All right, introduction. In this article, I examine Leonard Percival Howell's foundational leadership of the Rastafari movement to show its contribution to black nationalism and by extension his role in Jamaica's fight against colonialism. I have chosen to focus on the attempt to suppress him by the colonial government, local press, traditional churches, labor leaders, and Creole nationalism, as well as part of the civilian population, including whites, colored, and blacks. The attempted suppression of Howell was an extensive campaign, which indicated the fear that Howell's message and activities might trigger the violent removal of British rule from colonial Jamaica. Howell and his lieutenant, Robert Hines, spread the idea of Rastafari movement during its early phase, when it gained traction among the poorest group in the society, the peasants. Hines, Joseph Hibbert, and Henry Archibald Dunkley later became leader of their own groups. Interestingly, it wasn't the institutional opposition to Howell per se that capitulated him and the early Rastafari movement to the national stage. Instead, antagonism towards Howell was couched in a resistance to his promotion of the divinity of Emperor Haile Selassie. Between 1932 and 1954, Howell preached the divinity of Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, who had been crowned in Addis Ababa in 1930 and established the first Rastafari community in Jamaica in the hills of St. Catherine Parish in 1940. In 1954, the police force of the partially Creole national government raided the Pinnacle encampment for the second time, hoping to end the popularity of Leonard Howell and the burgeoning Rastafari movement. Howell's message was revolutionary. He advised the black people of colonial Jamaica that Emperor Haile Selassie was the head over all man and the supreme God. Advice or instruction that he repeated in his small book, The Promised Key, which was published in 1935. Howell delivered a message to African Jamaicans that was similar to that one that Marcus Garvey had enunciated after his own return to Jamaica in 1927. This was the Africans in every part of the global African diaspora should look east to Ethiopia for the crowning of a king who would lead them out of white domination. Garvey had abandoned this idea in 1937 after Selassie fled to London to escape the Italian occupation of Ethiopia, which started in May 1936. In an infamous editorial, Garvey condemned the Ethiopian emperor as a coward. However, Howell never lost his faith in the emperor and continued to advocate the millenarian perspective of his ascension in 1930 as the fulfillment of a biblical prophecy and the beginning of black liberation in Jamaica and around the world. In recent years, the scholarship on Howell has been a great deal of growth. This is a welcome change in light of the years of neglect, seen from the start of Rastafari studies in the work of the American anthropologist George E. Simpson, who had not even mentioned Howell in his groundbreaking article. Simpson, 1955, in the famous report on the Rastafari movement in Kingston, Jamaica, published in 1960, Howell was presented to the public mainly as a criminal and as someone who was quite likely insane. Leonard E. Barrett and Joseph Owen studied in the 1960s and 1970s, spread knowledge of the Rastafarian movement. Howell was mentioned as one of the founders of the movement in their studies, but he was not examined in great details, and the attempt to suppress him were not given the deserved attention. However, there is at present a great deal more on Howell in terms of scholarship. The chain started with Robert Hill's gripping article, which was published in 1981 or in the same year that Howell died. This was followed in the 1980s and 1990s by studies by Michael Hoenisch, Barry Chauvinis, Frank Jack Van Dyke, and William David Spencer, and in the first decade of this century by Helen Lee and Charlie Price. My departure from this work is my focus on the attempts to suppress Howell, attempts which was largely unsuccessful. given both the worldwide success of Rastafarianism and Jamaican independence. Despite Lee's argument, Howell did not become weary or disheartened because of the attempts that were made to bring about his suppression. After suffering for years on behalf of the Rastafari movement, it was no longer necessary for Howell to occupy the national spotlight. Other leaders were in place to carry on the work that Howell had started. Claudius Henry, for example, had established an encampment of his own in the hills of St. Andrew Parish in 1959. And the revisionist Dr. Vernon Carrington, also known as Prophet Gad, founded the 12th Tribe Mansion in 1968, which managed to gain adherents from among the brown-skinned or colored middle class of Jamaica. After the 1954 police incursion at Pinnacle, Howell decided to play a secondary role, leaving the movement in the hands of the other leaders. They began to modify the early doctrine of Howell and to broaden the leadership provided by Hines. Hibbert, Dunkley, and Altamont Reed, meanwhile, reports in the Daily Gleaner, which had remained the most widely circulated newspaper in colonial Jamaica, showed that Howell continued to be harangued by the government and its police force and by members of the civilian population after 1954. There were reports that Howell was attacked more than once at Pinnacle due to his unwavering stance on the cultivation of marijuana in the community, and of course its use as a sacrament by members of the Rastafari movement. The police returned to Pinnacle several times following the second raid in 1954 and ganja eradication expedition, and to remove any remaining followers of Howell who were still residing in the community. These raids even took place during the post-colonial period of the 1970s under Michael Manley government, which had embraced an Afrocentric policy in its promotion of Jamaica's cultural identity, one that drew from the philosophy of the Rastafari movement. In essence, Manley adopted the black nationalism of Rastafari as a way to gain widespread support from the island's black majority for his democratic socialist ideology. Because of this, Howell could not have withdrawn himself fully from the spotlight as one of the founders of Rastafari, even if this was what he might have wanted to do. I am also particularly concerned that Charles Price becoming Rasta, Origins of Rastafari Identity in Jamaica, in which the author argues that Howell was thrust into the national spotlight by the government's attempt to quash the Rastafari during the period of British colonial rule, and suggests that the publicity that Rastafari got from the attempts to suppress the movement was one of the unintended consequence of the campaign, or by reporting on Howell and Rastafari and by reprimanding Howell, the authorities' effort to disrupt the emergent Rastafari had the unanticipated consequence of amplifying their beliefs. In other words, the movement was able to undergo at least some of its growth within colonial Jamaica because measures were taken by the government to undermine and to end the leadership of foundational figures such as Howell. This is an interesting thesis, but it is essentially untrue. In fact, Howell was the one who made himself famous, promoting the message of Rastafari and black nationalism and the colonial regime. Fearing popular independence and revolution, responded in one of the longest and most consistent campaign against any opponents of colonialism in British Jamaica during the 20th century. Howell remained the main target, even when it was his community of Pinnacle that was raided by the police and his followers were sent to jail. He was already in the national spotlight when the campaign to suppress him began. And it was his popularity and the potential that this had to grow even further, that threw his opposition into a state of frenzy. This rage, hey, watch out, bear with me, because I re-visualize the whole atmosphere of the day while I read it, forgive me. You see, Yeah. This rage and the eagerness to see him undermined continued unabated as Howell was in jail and condemned to the lunatic asylum in Kingston. Even while locked away, his list of opponents grew, and calls were made by the group from outside of the colonial government to take further and decisive action to bring about an effective end to Howell's activities and his influence. Hornish suggests these views in his article, but his use of Foucault's framework to explain the attempts to suppress Howell as a colonial spectacle seems problematic because it suggests the anti-Howell campaign was an almost exclusive colonial undertaking, as perspective echoed by Van Dyke. Howell's suppression, or the attempts made to suppress him, was not solely a colonial reaction. When the Dangerous Drug Act was amended in 1948 to make marijuana illegal, for example, the government at that moment was partially democratic. Power was shared between the colonizers and an elected House of Representatives. The latter was established under the Moyne Constitution of 1944, which had introduced universal adult suffrage in that year. Yet another major change in the direction of a democratic government, which was comprised of representatives of the general population. Background leadership context. Background leadership and the context. All right. Howell is widely regarded as the first Rastafarian leader, indicated, for instance, by Helen Lee, something like Helen Lee, the first Rasta, Leonard Howell, and the rise of Rastafarianism. Born in Red Hills, a district in the parish of Clarendon, Jamaica, on the 16th of June, 1898, Howell was of African descent, and his dark complexion enhanced his leadership. But in the context of colonial Jamaica, this also ensured that he would have to struggle to maintain the leadership position. The most prominent leaders by the end of the 1930s were the color of brown-skinned Creole nationalists, Alexander Bustamante, Norman Manley, who were leaders of the labor movement. Howell became their adversary party because he had put himself into the role of a leader of the poor and dispossessed majority of the island, and partly because of his dark skin complexion, which made him a more attractive option as a leader to the majority African population, that his brown-skinned competitors at the head of the organized labor movement. All right. It was clear that Howell shared the history of the black majority, namely the subjugation and dispossession under British slavery and British colonial rule. Creole nationalists rejected as too revolutionary Howell's black nationalists, but they could not ignore him. Creole nationalists rejected as too revolutionary Howell's black nationalism, but they could not ignore him. Howell's emergence in Clarendon took place at a time when many East Indians lived in part of the parish. It is therefore no surprise that, as both Hill and Lee had pointed out, Howell made use of his exposure to Indian culture and the Hindi language. Evidence of this was seen in his decision to alter the promise key under the pseudonym G.G. Maharaj, which his followers later expanded to Ganganguru Maharaj, and then contracted to Gang, names which Howell embraced and demonstrated the political influence of the Indian culture. Indians had arrived as indentured laborers and were attracted to Howell by his opposition to colonialism. Based on their experience in Jamaica and through his association with the Indian, he enhanced his anti-colonial message. An estimated 37,000 Indians had arrived in Jamaica between 1843 and 1916, mostly to do the plantation work that the black population had done as slaves, and which many had abandoned after the emancipation of 1838. They were unwilling to accept the unfair wages, high rents for plantation houses, and the poor management practices of the planters. To make matters worse, most of these planters were also their farmer slaveholders. Howell's use of Hindu visual symbolism in the promotion of the Rastafari movement had received attention from scholars, and the most recent work on this has been done by the late art historian Petrine Archer. In addition, the ritual use of marijuana and its association with Indians, which appear in the tradition of sadhana and prasad, has been examined in their studies. By joining African and Indian tradition in his shaping of the Rastafari movement, Howell gave both group representation and a sense of agency in colonial Jamaica. Together, they made Howell at least not objectable to Indians, while his popularity among dark-skinned African identified Jamaicans grew. Unlike many of his black and brown followers, Howell was quite literate, not only writing The Promise Key, but starting a newspaper, The People's Voice, in the late 1930s. And as Chavans has observed, Howell promoted himself as learned and well-read, adding a range of identities and titles including scientist, medical doctor, philosopher, and prophet. Howell further intrigued his followers. Together, these identities enhanced his authority by giving his followers the impression that he was a man of many talents, therefore someone who was undoubtedly qualified to lead. When he returned to Jamaica in 1932, Howell had been away since 1916, living as an immigrant like the Indians who came to Jamaica. He was only 18 years old when he left the island. The story that Lee has told is that his father sent Howell away to protect him after the youngster witnessed the murder of Caroline Francis by Edward Rodney in the Red Hills area. However, Monty Howell, the eldest of Leonard Howell's children, has informed me that his father left Jamaica because both his parents, not only his father, felt that this was the best move after he had seen the murder. This was a heinous act and a condemnation of the colonial society of Jamaica, where law and order were supposed to prevail, and where young people, black, colored, white, or otherwise, should have been protected from such an event. Even for a mother, it was better to send her teenage son away than to have him live in this society. Howell's leaving was the beginning of his contempt for colonial Jamaica, which would only deepen and remain with him for life. He later claimed that he ended up in Colon, Panama, which is quite possibly true in light of the fact that this country, and particularly the seaport of Colon, whose coast is on the Caribbean Sea, was the area that received around 31,041 Caribbean migrants who went there in search of work as artisans and laborers between 1904 and 1914. The conditions in the area of Colon were harder than these migrants had expected. Many contracted disease and many died, especially from malaria, yellow fever, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. Some were injured on the job or died from job-related accidents. But because of wages which were as high as US $2 per day if unskilled and US $5 if they were skilled workers, they continued to flood the area looking for work. Wow. Yeah, they continue to flood the area looking for work. Howell said that he was among them, but for only a short while, and survived the experience. He claimed that he had joined the Jamaican war contingent, and after which he was employed on an American merchant ship owned by the United Fruit Company that was bound for Canada in 1918. The documentation to Mr. United Fruit Company, if United Fruit Company could have go back in time, they would have go send back a time travel and go wait for Leonard or at the shipport and said, nah, go back. And for matter of fact, they send him back to Jamaica. But anyway, we could continue with the sweet reading of the high man, Leonard. You'll see it. Yeah, joined the Jamaican War contingent, and after which a United Fruit Company that was bonded for Canada in 1918. All right. The documentation to prove all of this has not been found. But this was a fascinating story from which Howell's leadership benefited. It gave his Rastafari followers the impression that he was a well-traveled individual and that his exposure had given him much to teach them. All right. His arrival in New York's Harlem in 1924 is documented, which had opened a new chapter in his life that would also help to shape his idea about his African identity. It was while in Harlem that he was in position to interact closely with Garveyites and where he joined Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. This period was intellectually stimulating for Howell. His arrival coincided with the Harlem Renaissance, the intellectual and cultural rebirth of African America, which had its heyday in 1920s, shaped in part by the Garvey movement and by black novelists, poets, and musicians. Fellow Jamaican Claude McKay and Marcus Garvey were also in Harlem at the time, and these outspoken figures espousing black nationalism may well have influenced Howell. It was during this 8-year period between his arrival in Harlem and return to Jamaica that Howell developed ideas about self-reliance within black communities. He became a construction worker, but then went into business and opened what he described as a tea room at 16th Street, 136th Street in Harlem, where he sold his Jamaican folk medicine. Howell seemed to have operated this tea room as a drugstore where the medicine were sold as teas. It was also mentioned that Howell was influenced by books about black consciousness, which were published during the 1920s. One was published in New Jersey in the same year that Howell arrived in Harlem, the Holy PB, or the Black Man's Bible, whose author was Shepard Robert Athley Rogers and Anguillian. Another that Hill mentioned is the Royal Parchment Scroll of Black Supremacy, written by Reverend Fitz Ballantyne Petersburg, a Jamaican, and which was published in Kingston, Jamaica in 1926. Howell integrated elements of these works into the Promise Key, but it is not fair to call this plagiarism, which Hill has done and which other researchers have since then adopted. Okay. Howell simply made use of knowledge that his black audience might have known and paid respect to the work of his predecessors by referring to black supremacy, which Peter Burke has defined as our triumph over white supremacy, our slave master. Howell had tried to ensure that his Rastafari followers saw the movement as not only a part of the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, but also the legacy left by past freedom fighters, a struggle which had withstood the test of time and which legitimized the Rastafari doctrine. Hill's remark about the Jamaican context into which Howell made his reappearance in 1932 are more useful. The island's black population had been preparing for a revolution stoked by the black nationalism of Alexander Bedward and the Pan-Africanism of Garvey. Howell benefited from the activism that was undertaken by both Bedward and Garvey, Bedouard had started a branch of the Native Baptist Church in Augustown, St. Andrew Parish, in the late 19th century, and this follower by 1921 had grown to around 30,000 people. He was known for his anti-colonial rhetoric and was confined for the second time to the asylum in Kingston by the colonial government in 1921 and remained there until his death in 1930. All them claims that Bedouard jump off of one building and kill himself. You know, said just know that Bedouard dead a madhouse. I only just learned that here. Well, anyway, I could get on. The colonial government will adopt the same strategy in its effort to suppress Howell. He too was committed to the Kingston Asylum in 1938 and in 1960. The Howellites also claimed that they believed their leader was sent to the asylum more than twice, but the documentation, again, has proven impossible to find. Symbolically, Bedouard's passing had occurred in the same year as the coronation event in Addis Ababa, which marked the ascension of the man whom the Rastafari saw as the Messiah, fulfilling biblical prophecies that the Son of God would return to save humankind. In other words, Bedouard's death, which was a loss, was nonetheless marked by the emergence of a more powerful figure who was a more compelling source of inspiration and hope for black people, Rastafari. Alright. Garvey had also spoken of the crowning of an Ethiopian king as an event to be seen as a major sign of hope for blacks all over the world, inspiring the African majority of Jamaica to continue to believe in the eventual subversion of white supremacy. Garvey's return to Jamaica in 1927 was followed by the founding of his People's Political Party in 1929, which had mass support, though the party did not win a seat in the island election of that year. However, this was only because its supporters were mainly poor black people who did not qualify to vote. On the 3rd, the branch of the UNIA in Kingston purchased Edelweiss Park at Crossroad, near to the heart of the city in 1929, and this became a center for spiritual upliftment, self-improvement, political indoctrination, and purposeful recreation. Garvey also continued to promote Pan-Africanism through his writing and his newspaper, The Black Man, The New Jamaican, and his magazine, Black Man, kept black Jamaicans aware of issues concerning their liberation from white rule. Upon his return, Howell was therefore able to benefit from preparation made by Garvey as well as by Bedouard. Okay. Early attacks on Howell. Yeah? Early attacks on Howell. Yeah. Anthony Bogues has established a link between the Rastafari and the radical African tradition, which had roots in Ethiopia. Yeah.